Yeah, hello everybody. It's good to be back. If you remember, I spoke about the Cyber Resilience Act at FOSS backstage a year ago, but it was a different situation because it was still work in progress, and that means that the situation has totally changed. It goes from we're talking about the merits of certain aspects of the new law to it's done now. It's published. It's the clock is ticking. We're going into implementation. And you heard in the previous presentation that maybe the CRA from a legal perspective is something to talk about next year. And you will hear in my presentation why this is absolutely not correct. But maybe from a legal perspective it is. But from a community and a manufacturer's perspective, I would say the time to look into the Cyber Resilience Act is probably just about now, or like 6 months ago. So who are we? We're Linux Foundation Europe. We are the European chapter of the Linux Foundation. Linux Foundation hosts projects like the Linux kernel, but also Kubernetes, but also SPDX or OpenChain or the Open Source Security Foundation. So organizations that very directly are related to the topics covered by the Cyber Resilience Act. Me, I do community development. I'm an open source contributor since '97. And I also teach open source and intellectual property at the Technical University in Berlin. Now let's jump in. Okay, so where do we stand today? Kind of update from last year. The Cyber Resilience Act was a legislative proposal from 2022, and it was approved by the European Parliament in March 24, and then, you know, there's a multi-step process of approval. The European Council has adopted it in October, and it was then published, and that means it went into force on December 10, 24. That's roughly 3 months ago. And we have a 3-year implementation period, 36 months, of which 3 months have now passed. So TikTok, this time is passing really fast, especially if you're in a larger organization and you need to kick off implementation measures that take some time to implement. There are ongoing implementation efforts already. For example, the European Commission has set up a Cyber Resilience Act experts group where we have multiple representatives from the open source ecosystem, including the Open Source Security Foundation there, which is great. It means that the stakeholders that are at the table for a good share represent the interests of our community. And maybe from this, the perspective of the importance of the Act, this is the first EU-level law that has a section heading saying free and open source software. This is the first law that explicitly separates actors who are organizing and hosting free and open source software projects from manufacturers that are their downstream consumers. And I think this is a massive step forward. If you think about it, that for 20 years maybe, we have argued with our national government and with the EU that free and open source software needs to be taken seriously. It plays a different role than the businesses involved. And now we're seeing this, and it's also a bit scary, if I may say that. Okay, so this was our introduction. Maybe for timeline, because of the 3-year implementation period, the full obligations will all apply by December 11, 27. Doesn't sound that far in the future, right? And some, especially the vulnerability reporting obligations, become effective already after 21 months. All right, so I basically have this agenda for you today. I would like to talk briefly about the new stakeholder roles and responsibilities. I'm talking about the awareness gap that we have identified and the need to change the engagement, especially if you're a manufacturer who consumes open source software, from passive engagement to an active engagement. And us being Linux Foundation, I'm in the wonderful position to basically give you a sneak peek of 2 reports we're publishing this week. One is on the cybersecurity posture of essential open source projects that you build your products on, like Yocto, or Zephyr, or the civil infrastructure platform. And the other one is a survey, and then the insights from that, on the awareness of the stakeholders involved about the new Act. The results are quite interesting, especially on the second one. Okay, let's talk about these new roles and responsibilities. as I said, this is the first time that at a EU-level law, we have separate roles for open source foundations or open source software stewards, as it is called, and manufacturers. It's a simplification if I say stewards are foundations. Stewards are organizations that provide sustained support for the development of open source projects and host them, basically. So there could be different kinds of organizations, but from our perspective, the work of an open source foundation fits very well into this picture. And one thing that the Cyber Resilience Act does, like you could ask, why do we need these two separate roles, manufacturers and open source software stewards? And one answer to that is it shields open source organizations from the responsibilities under the Cyber Resilience Act that are leveled on manufacturers. Manufacturers are responsible for the cybersecurity capabilities of the products that they introduce into the European market. And by creating these separate roles, the EU has made it quite clear that the manufacturer of such a product is not the open source foundation that you consume from, or the open source project that you use as a dependency. And this is a really important one. So the two roles that I've mentioned already are manufacturer and open source software steward. If you hear me say the word steward, that is the short version of open source software steward. So a manufacturer is fully responsible for the compliance with the CRA of the products that they introduce into the market. Very important here is this does not say a European manufacturer. It says if you bring something into the European or EU market, then you have to comply with this law. Which is a very important insight when it comes to, for example, the impact on competition, because it means that a manufacturer who resides outside of the European Union also has to bear the effort, basically, to implement the Cyber Resilience Act if they want to offer products in Europe. I think that's a reasonable approach. So another very, very important aspect that the CRA makes absolutely explicit is that it says that the responsibility for the cybersecurity aspects, basically attributes, of the software that a manufacturer consumes lies solely with this manufacturer, not with the upstream community. The manufacturer is responsible to perform due diligence checks to decide if the open source component that they are integrating into their product is fit for purpose or not. And if they make a mistake, it's the manufacturer's responsibility. And there are then other follow-up responsibilities, like you have to mark with the CE mark that your product is compliant with the Cyber Resilience Act, etc. On the other side, if you see the responsibilities of stewards, they're purposefully lighter, meaning they're not responsible. Stewards are not responsible for products because they don't bring products commercially into the market. The responsibilities cover cybersecurity policies, meaning as a foundation, for example, we will have to, and already have, set up points of contact where you as consumers can report cybersecurity vulnerabilities in the products, and we trace them and we distribute that information to the other users. You can report fixes to us. We can participate in voluntary vulnerability reporting and attestation schemes, and we have to cooperate with market surveillance authorities, for example, when there's a major issue, like the Heartbleed bug was in the past, to identify, for example, which software is affected by that. But you see that the roles are really different. The role of the steward is to facilitate the viability of an upstream open source project. And there's another very important clause in there that says if you contribute to a project that is under somebody else's responsibility, you are not covered by the Cyber Resilience Act. This is a very common misunderstanding, that's why I'm highlighting this. As an open source developer, if you are contributing to a project, if you provide a merge request, if you send an email with a patch, you're not covered by the Cyber Resilience Act. The Cyber Resilience Act does not create a barrier for individual developers to contribute to open source projects. Very important. What the Cyber Resilience Act does not really go into is the relationship between the open source community and manufacturers. Now, we know that the community comes in different shapes. We have individual developers, we have loose networks of contributors who jointly develop a project that maybe do not have a legal entity that represents them. We have foundations that host projects. If there's a legal entity involved, then that's the steward. And communities that are loosely organized and are not legally incorporated are not covered by the Cyber Resilience Act, and neither are individual developers if they're not commercial. What is important is that if you're a manufacturer and you read the Cyber Resilience Act and you hear about a 5-year mandatory maintenance period of cybersecurity fixes, then you need to realize that you have to work with the upstream community for the software that you consume, because you will have to maintain every product from the day the last one of it rolls out of the factory gate for 5 years or longer. And that means that every piece of software that you ship, if a cybersecurity vulnerability is identified in it, has to be updated, and then that patch has to be provided to consumers free of charge. And if you work at the manufacturer, the homework that you have to do is that you have to say, how can we do that? How can we make sure that the products, the dependencies that we depend on, remain viable in that time, and that we're actually capable of integrating their updates? And in this situation, it is very important to remember that open source maintainers owe you nothing. I've added the link. I'll publish the slides, so you don't have to take pictures. But the maintainers of the projects that you consume are, from your perspective, volunteers. You can't come in and say, oh, next Monday I want to make a product release, so you better have that bug fixed. You can say that. It's probably not going to work. Which means, as a manufacturer, you will have to engage and say, can I maybe help you fix that bug by Monday? Can I dedicate resources to do that? Can I help you integrate and make a new release in time for my plans? And that's the community-manufacturer relationship that we believe is actually at the heart of the implementation of the Cyber Resilience Act. And much of that is actually not written in the law. This is for us to figure out, for the manufacturers and the upstream communities. The whole thing reshapes the governance of open source projects. Any incorporated open source project, meaning having a legal entity, has certain minimum governance requirements leveled against it now. In a way, I believe that the European Union is doing the homework for us and kind of pushes us to level up governance. But this also means that if you are in a position of being a manufacturer and you need to make sure that your product stays viable for 5 years or longer, then you may have to engage in the upstream projects at the governance level. Because you want to influence the roadmap, you want to make sure that the project is viable, and you want to understand what the technical direction is and if it fits your products. And to gain influence on that, you participate in the project. You can dedicate developer resources and others, and you can participate in the project also from a financial perspective. A key piece of homework, and I think I've been saying this for many years now, is that if you're a manufacturer, you need to understand what your critical dependencies are and which community develops them and how healthy this community is, and if you want to go and support that community to stay viable. All right. That was only the introduction to the key aspects of the Cyber Resilience Act, and it was way too short because there is a lot more in there, but I only have 30 minutes. Let me get to the second aspect, and this is the why should you have started 6 months ago on this. You can't comply with what you don't understand. And as I said, I'm in the happy position that I can quote here from a report that is coming up probably on Thursday. So please watch our Linux Foundation research website, and it's all under Creative Commons licenses, as it should be. 62% of all respondents to our survey say that they have low familiarity with the requirements of the Cyber Resilience Act globally. 2/3. 3 years is not a long time. And if today you're one of those 62%, I suggest you start reading. So yeah, the current state of awareness, I think the title of the report is Unprepared and Unaware, something like that. So we're trying to be issue a wake-up call to the community here. So yeah, low familiarity of 62% of the participants. Only 28% identified correctly 2027 as the compliance deadline. 1/4. Not great. And more than half do not understand the distinction between stewards and manufacturers. Yeah, so as I said, the report comes out this week, so you can look into this. But I think this is not a situation that we should be happy with. And if you work in an organization that has more than 100 employees, then you have 2 years and 9 months left to implement the Cyber Resilience Act. And you know how long bigger projects like this go. I'm trying not to look at anybody here. So yeah, this should send you home with some homework. However, as I said, we've also analyzed projects that we host and try to understand their cybersecurity posture compared to the requirements of the Cyber Resilience Act. And this is the good news. We looked at the civil infrastructure platform, the Yocto project, and the Zephyr project. I know that people in the room here are building products with Yocto and Zephyr. So, and some are shipping products that integrate the long-term maintained components from the civil infrastructure platform. These are all projects that form the technical foundations of your products. So you're taking what the community develops and you're building your products on top of that. So they have a leverage effect, a multiplier effect. If there's a vulnerability or bad practice in any of these projects, it affects many downstream manufacturers' products. However, we found that these products are actually really well prepared. For example, the civil infrastructure platform is the first adopter of the IEC norm on critical infrastructure maintenance. And has a 10-year maintenance window, so way longer than what the Cyber Resilience Act requires. Now, this also restricts a little bit which components you can use, because only components that fulfill these requirements are in there. The Yocto project has reproducible builds, and it creates SBOMs as part of your build process that are matching your digital images. And it has a very well-structured vulnerability management process. The Zephyr project is a CV numbering authority. It has its own PSERT, a product security incident response team, and has automated security scanning in the development pipelines. So why am I saying it this way? Because this is all free and open source software. Both the software itself, but also the way it is developed are transparent and open. You can go and learn from these projects how they develop, how they build their SBOMs, etc. Nothing of this is black magic, and it's all out there. So I kind of like send you home with the homework. You need to get ready for this, but here are also tools that you can use and projects you can follow. So this part, these are 2 reports, as I said, and this part, the report on the cybersecurity posture of critical open source projects, actually left me with quite a good feeling. And it comes with a whole set of recommendations at the end, so I really encourage you to read it. So the last takeaway from what we've been researching is that there needs to be a shift. We still see that most manufacturers and actually most downstream users are not contributors to free and open source software projects. So we have this like long tail of the majority of consumers as a consumer, and only a small fraction kind of converts into a contributor at some point. And I think for an individual consumer of software components, that's fine. But if you are consuming these components to integrate them into a product and ship them, it's not. Some numbers here, only 1/3 of the manufacturers that we looked at produces SBOMs with their products, or at least makes them available. Nearly half rely passively on the upstream projects that they use, meaning like for security fixes, meaning they're not engaging, they're not supporting the projects and maintaining their security issues. And so on. So you see the numbers. This is not a situation that we can allow to remain this way. The requirement for manufacturers, from my perspective, is very clear. For the critical dependencies that you have, you need to identify which community develops them and make sure that the development roadmap of that project matches your product roadmap and the product lifecycle, the span of maintenance that you will have to ensure. And if that's not the case, or if you're not fully aware of what's happening, then you need to actively engage in the governance of these projects. And yes, this will make it, for open source projects, slightly more challenging to fulfill the governance criteria that manufacturers will look for. So there's my expectation, a certain coming of age effect for many of the critical free and open source software projects that will have to all kind of jump that barrier, adhere to these standards. And projects that are coming from like an individual developer and are starting to become very widely used will see a barrier, a challenge ahead of themselves to set up the governance that is necessary to be a critical free and open source software project. So the required shift that I would encourage everybody to consider is that you comprehensively track what your dependencies are, that you apply due diligence as they actually requires on the open source components that you consume, that you proactively manage vulnerabilities and set up processes where you can submit the vulnerability fixes to the upstream projects. And I really encourage everybody to look into actively contributing upstream, because this is the best knowledge transfer mechanism to learn about how your upstream dependencies work. If you have staff that has spent time on modifying, extending, updating projects that you're using, you will have much better insight on the roadmap of these projects, on how they work, etc. So this is like, it's not a requirement in the Cyber Resilience Act at all, but it's a good consequence to think about. Is how do I build up the capacity to do all this? Well, you know, active contributions is one way. From the engaged manufacturers that we work with, here are some recommendations what helps them. They very actively assess the security posture of their open source dependencies. They do maintain SBOMs and publish them. They develop internal development capacities to to fix security issues in the components that they use. They contribute these fixes upstream, and they support the long-term viability of key open source software projects that they're using. Now let me speed up a little bit. We've consulted many manufacturers that work with us, and as I said, we host many open source projects, and we identified 3 work streams that form the implementation roadmap of what Linux Foundation does. One is, we call it standards, basically converting existing best practices like the OpenSSF scorecard and others, or the open chain standards, to basically recognize standards and to be in line with the CRA. There is a working group established at the Open Source Security Foundation, and each work stream has a special interest group, and the links to that are at the end. The second work stream is awareness. That's why we're doing these reports. So the ones that are coming out this week are part of the awareness work stream. We're trying to understand where the open source community is today, what it needs to do to implement the Cyber Resilience Act. And the last one is tooling. You know that the Linux Foundation hosts projects like SPDX or OpenChain, which are long-standing projects that shape how the supply chain looks for software. We now have the OpenSSF with multiple projects like Scorecard or the security baseline. So this work contributes to leveling up the whole community to comply with this CRA. With that, I think we've seen the word opportunity on screen a couple of times today, and I would like to say it one more time. I think that for the people here in the room, for the free and open source software ecosystem, the Cyber Resilience Act represents an immense opportunity to strengthen cybersecurity. The collaborative approach that we're applying to developing software makes it, first of all, practically possible to do what the CRA requires, and to really raise the tides for all boats. We as Linux Foundation are providing resources, guidance, collaboration opportunities for that, and really believe that if we work together, we can establish a much more secure software supply chain. There are some significant challenges that remain. As you've seen, some critical open source projects are well prepared, and manufacturers not so aware, if you've seen the numbers. One aspect that worries me a little bit is that our strength as the open source community in general was always show me the code. It was participate, contribute to the project, don't argue for half a year. Now we're being asked to do committee work for 3 years. And it's already showing that we just don't have the people with this mindset and interest in doing this kind of work. So this is something we need to build up. And one issue that also worries me a little bit is that cybersecurity regulation is a global issue. Yes, the European Union with the Cyber Resilience Act is trying to have an international impact, which is great because it's a horizontal regulation. But I don't see great chances that international collaboration on these issues will increase in the next months and years. And you've heard Juta's talk. It's time to maybe do our homework ourselves. And with that, here are my 3 takeaways for you. Understand the new stakeholder roles and responsibilities. Increase awareness and readiness for the Cyber Resilience Act. Make these embarrassing numbers look better in the future, basically. And if you're a downstream user and adopter of open source components, shift from passive to active open source engagement. These are the 2 reports, this one and that one. These are the links to the Open Source Security Foundation working groups, and here are the QR codes that you can scan to get there. Thank you.
So there used to be a Linux Foundation project called the Core Infrastructure Initiative, which tried to do this kind of work on behalf of the members. Do you think, I don't know if it exists anymore, but do you think such a project would also be feasible, or is it discussed at the moment? So that's
it's funny you should ask that. That is the Open Source Security Foundation. This is the same organization evolved. So, yeah.
So, do you think that there's a risk that that manufacturers will, instead of complying with this kind of poorly defined relationship that they need to have with open source stewards, that they then instead decide to choose closed source solutions to avoid the complication? Well, is there a risk that this could unintentionally hurt open source, I guess is my question.
That is something that was discussed a lot in the debate, as I said, kind of before it was published. And I personally don't believe that's going to happen for the simple reason that we estimate that between 80 and 95% of all your dependencies are open source. So yes, you could make that ill-advised decision to put that all in-house and maintain yourself, then your development cost will go up by 10 to 20 times. And I think no manufacturer can afford that. So yes, actually the report contains a number, 6% is the estimated additional effort of maintaining cybersecurity imposed by the Cyber Resilience Act on manufacturers. 6% is a much lower number than 20 times the development cost. So that's why I don't think this is going to happen.
I'm going to read the question online. Do you see that this is an opportunity for commercial open source distributors to take on that responsibility for manufacturers? What is their role in these from the Linux Foundation point of view? Of course, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, very good question. I've explained everything kind of in a simplified relationship between upstream open source projects hosted by a steward maybe and the manufacturer. There's absolutely room here for value-added businesses, like basically a Linux distribution that covers many of the responsibilities under the Cyber Resilience Act, like contributing security patches upstream, as a paid service to commercial manufacturers that pay them for that. So with that, I would say that the Cyber Resilience Act actually opens business opportunities for developers of open source software that would like to take this role of simplifying this job for businesses. Maybe one caveat here is that the Cyber Resilience Act contains clauses where it defines what monetization is of the software. And it says if you monetize the software, you're considered to be a commercial vendor, not an open source project. Now, if you are a single vendor project and you hold all the rights on your product, on your open source component, all the copyright, and you're offering consultancy on the side, you are probably seen as a manufacturer, not a steward, because you're commercializing the software. It's not a bad thing in itself, it's just, it is very important that when you act in this space, that you know what role you play, because it defines your roles and responsibilities.
I was gonna phrase this as a question, but I think I'll just phrase it as, I'll be non-cheeky and phrase it as a statement, just to on the OpenSSF working group that you mentioned. I think people in this room might be interested to know that they can join that working group it is completely open to anyone to join. You don't have to be an OpenSSF member. You don't have to be affiliated with Linux Foundation. You can be anybody and join that working group and participate. And actually, that's a great way to learn more about this and participate in the community of people that are developing this kind of stuff. Sorry.
Very good. I actually have a speaker note here that I skipped over that says exactly that. So thank you, Daniel. And he's also one of the people that are doing the hard work on this. I just get to do flashy presentations.
Okay, so I should probably contextualize this first by saying that I am a consumer and thus stand to benefit from the CRA and an individual developer. And in that role, as you say, my responsibilities under it are minimal to non-existent. But my question / concern with the CRA is, does it have teeth? Because we've already seen the EU, one attempt by the EU to regulate the tech industry in the form of GDPR, DSGVO. And we've seen a couple of enforcement actions against the big 5, big 6 tech companies, but enforcement against other, even still quite comparatively large companies has been pretty minimal. And you still see patterns that are illegal, like pay for privacy, like badgering people to accept cookies and so on, which are illegal, still being used by major companies like Axel Springer and so on and so forth. What guarantee, is there any work going into creating a more credible enforcement for CRA than we have seen for tech industry regulation generally so far?
Yeah, so your question is, does the CRA have teeth? So one thing it does have is a description of penalties, which can be quite substantial, 2.5% of annual turnover or 15 million, something like that, whichever is higher. So in terms of like, could this hurt if you ignore it? Yes. Enforcement is left to the EU member states' market surveillance authorities. Some of these have teeth, like the BSI in Germany is actually, I think, quite well set up for that. And the other issue that I see, the aspect that I see, is that consumers can actually ask for it. So if you're a consumer and you have a product and it stops shipping security updates after 2 years, you can actually ask for it. You can sue the company to do it. And the CRA is quite explicit about, for example, that if you don't provide your functional updates free of charge, then you have to provide security updates separate and free of charge for at least 5 years. And if the product can reasonably be expected to work longer, then for longer. So I think it has teeth. But the European Commission representatives have described it as, we would like to have the Swiss cheese to have fewer holes. We know that we will not get rid of all the holes, but if we can make a contribution to reduce the number of holes, then that's great. Not great. Not sure if that's great to cheese, but so I think it's going to make a contribution in that direction. I think we still have to work on cybersecurity outside of that.
Thank you so much. We are at time for the questions, but thank you so much, Mirko, for your presentation.